The day after Christmas, 1900, you're standing on the deck of a relief ship called the Hesperus, fighting heavy swell 20 miles west of the last inhabited edge of Scotland. Your name is Joseph Moore. You're a lighthouse keeper, and up on that cliff, 200 feet above the sea, is your station. And something is wrong. No flag on the flagstaff. No empty supply boxes waiting at the landing. None of the 3 men you live and work with coming down the steps to meet the ship. And the relief is 11 days overdue. The captain sounds the ship's whistle. Nothing. He fires a signal rocket. Nothing. They row you to the landing alone. You will say, later, that a strange, cold dread settled on you as you climbed the 160 steps cut into the cliff. The gate at the top, closed. The entrance door, closed. Inside, the fire is cold. The clock on the kitchen wall has stopped. You call their names: Duckett, Marshall, MacArthur. You search every room, every stairwell, the lamp room at the top. The island is empty, and the last words in the lighthouse records, written on the morning the men were last known alive, read, "God is over all." Those were Joseph Moore's boots. Stay in them a while, because everything you think you know about what he found is about to come apart. The Flannan Isles. 7 splinters of rock in the open North Atlantic, 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis. Sailors called them the Seven Hunters. Shepherds ferried sheep out in summer to graze, but by long tradition, no one stayed the night. The islands had an older reputation. The old Gaelic name for going ashore there translated roughly as visiting the other country. In 1899, the Northern Lighthouse Board finished 4 years of brutal construction on the largest island, Eilean Mor, a 75-foot tower, whose light, first lit in December 1899, could be seen for over 20 miles. Every stone, every ton of coal, every barrel of oil had been hauled up those cliffs by crane and by hand. 4 keepers were assigned to the station, rotating so that 3 were always on the rock. In December 1900, the 3 men on duty were James Ducat, the principal keeper, 43 years old, 22 years of service, a wife, and 4 children on the mainland, Thomas Marshall, his young assistant, and Donald MacArthur, an occasional keeper, a local man filling in for the regular 3rd keeper, who was ashore, sick. On the 7th of December, the lighthouse superintendent visited the station on a routine inspection. He shook their hands and sailed home. He was, as far as the record shows, the last outsider ever to see them. 8 nights later, the 15th of December, a steamer called the Arctur, inbound for Leith, passed the Flannans in filthy weather. The captain knew these waters. He looked for the light. The rock was dark. What the relief party found on December 26th has been retold for a century and a quarter. And the story, as it is usually told, goes like this. The kitchen table was laid for a meal, cold meat, pickles, potatoes, and the meal was untouched, or half-eaten, in some tellings. A chair lay overturned on the floor, as if someone had leapt up from it in terror. The clock had stopped. By the door, the oilskins told their own story. 2 sets were missing, Duckett's and Marshall's. But MacArthur's coat still hung on its hook. Whatever called him outside, into a North Atlantic December, he went in his shirt sleeves. And then, there is the log. December 12th, written by Marshall. Gale, north by northwest. Sea lashed to fury. Ducat irritable. Later, storm still raging. Ducat quiet. MacArthur crying. Think about that entry. 3 lighthouse men, veterans of the worst seas in Europe, and one of them is described as crying. December 13th. Storm continued through night. Ducat quiet. MacArthur praying. And then the final entry. December 15th. Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. Here is what made that log famous. When researchers checked the weather records from Lewis, 20 miles away, there was no storm on the 12th. No storm on the 13th. The sea around the Flannans, according to every station and range, was calm until the 20th. So what storm were three experienced keepers describing? What was a grown man praying about on a quiet sea? What did they see from that tower that the rest of Scotland couldn't? For 125 years, that question has kept this story alive. There's just one problem with it, and we'll get there. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does a mystery. Into three empty beds, the world poured its theories. The sea gave up its oldest ones first. A serpent, a ghost ship. Some said an enormous seabird had carried the men off, one by one. Locals remembered why nobody slept on the Flannans. St. Flannan's Chapel stands on Island Moor, 1,000 years old, and the other country did not care for permanent guests. The rational theories weren't much more comforting. It was 1900. Europe was thick with invasion panic. So, foreign agents, landing by night, seizing the keepers for the secrets of the coast, or a passing ship, short of crew, pressing three strong men into service. And then, the darkest one, the one whispered in the lighthouse service itself. 3 men, alone for weeks on a rock the size of a few football pitches. Cabin fever, a quarrel. MacArthur, the stand-in, the outsider, a man with a known temper, kills the other 2, throws the bodies from the cliff, and follows them down. It would explain the coat left on the hook. A man doesn't dress for the weather when he's decided not to come back. Every theory feeds on one of those famous details. The overturned chair, terror, the untouched meal, interruption, the crying keeper, something seen, the missing light, something arrived. The details are doing all the work, which is why what I'm about to tell you matters. Because most of those details are fiction, and we can prove it. Open the actual file. Not the retellings, the primary record, the Northern Lighthouse Board archive, and the official investigation conducted on the island within days by Superintendent Robert Muirhead, the same man who had shaken the keeper's hands on December 7th. First, the half-eaten meal and the overturned chair. They're not in Joseph Moore's account. They're not in Muirhead's report. What the record actually says is the opposite. The kitchen was clean. The pots and pans washed and put away. The fire long cold. No meal. No chair. So, where did they come from? A poem. Flannan Isles, written by Wilfred Wilson Gibson in 1912, 12 years after the event. A work of fiction, so vivid, the table spread for dinner, untouched, that it bled backwards into memory and became fact. Most of what the world knows about the Flannan Isles, it learned from a poem. Second, the log. MacArthur crying, "God is over all." No trace of those entries exists in any official record. Keeper's logs weren't even written that way. No principal keeper records his colleagues' tears in a maintenance log. The entries surface decades later in sensational magazine retellings, and the researcher Mike Dash, who traced every version of this story back through the archives in the 1990s, concluded they were almost certainly a journalist's invention. The famous calm sea contradiction dissolves with them. There was no impossible storm, because there were no impossible log entries. So strip away the poem and the pulp. What's left? What did Muirhead actually find? This. On the west landing, the crane platform 70 feet above the sea, ropes torn loose and strewn across the rocks. A supply box, wedged into a crevice 110 feet above the waterline, smashed, its contents scattered. Iron railings, bent. A 1-ton block of stone, displaced. And higher still, 200 feet up, the clifftop turf ripped away in strips. 110 feet. The sea had reached 110 feet up that cliff, and higher. And the human details, the real ones. Ducats and Marshall's oilskins and sea boots. Gone. They were dressed for the landing. The morning's work inside. Done. The lamp, cleaned, refilled, ready to be lit that evening. Whatever happened in the afternoon of December 15th, hours before the Arkster passed a dark rock. So follow the evidence up those steps one last time. A real storm is coming. The barometer is falling. and the gear at the west landing has to be secured, or it will be lost. Duquette and Marshall dress and go down. MacArthur stays inside. Regulations required one keeper in the light at all times. Then something goes wrong. Perhaps MacArthur on watch sees a monstrous set of swells rising out of a heavy sea. Perhaps he sees his colleagues in trouble. He doesn't stop for his coat. He runs. The west landing sits above a narrow inlet, a rock gully that funnels a swell and detonates it upward, without warning, far above the height of any ordinary wave. The kind of freak sea that smashes a crate at 110 feet, 3 men within reach of one another. One wave. The sea does not need a serpent. In the 1950s, a keeper on that same rock, Walter Aldebert, spent 4 years photographing waves bursting over the island and was nearly carried off the landing himself in conditions he judged safe. He believed he was photographing exactly what killed his predecessors. The men who knew the rock best never doubted it. The verdict of this file: no spies, no serpent, no madness. 3 careful men at one of the loneliest posts on Earth, caught on open rock by a sea that reached higher that afternoon than anyone alive had seen it reach. 2 doing their duty to the station, and 1, almost certainly, running coatless into a December gale to warn them. The legend gave them a ghost story. The file gives them back their names: James Duquette, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur. And that night, December 26th, 1900, Joseph Moore lit the lamp his 3 colleagues had cleaned and readied on the morning they vanished. The light burned with keepers beneath it for another 70 years. In 1971, the station was automated. No one has kept the Flannan light since. And if the island ever felt like the other country, it belongs to that country fully now. The meal on the table was never there. The crying man never wrote a word. But the smashed box, 110 feet up the cliff, that's real. That's in the file. The sea keeps its own log. This file is closed, as far as it can ever be. If you want the next one opened, you know what to do. The archive is never empty.